Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 33, Divided We Stand. We left last week with Harry Truman leaving the White House and Dwight Eisenhower moving in. It's their voices you heard in the addendum episode, Harry discussing his time in office and Dwight his hopes for the country moving forward. As we discussed last episode, Eisenhower had to strip away much of the nuance of presidential campaigns and elections in the United States, won the White House with a mandate to end the Korean War. The Truman administration was unable to end the war after 2.5 years of fighting and negotiating, so what made anyone think that an Eisenhower administration would be any different? For one, he was the most famous general to come out of World War II. For another, there was a change in ruling party, with the Democratic Truman replaced by the Republican Eisenhower. But when Ike first got into office, not much changed in the general American policy on the conduct of the war. He did withdraw the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet from its position between mainland China and Taiwan, which was heavily supported by conservatives, both foreign and domestic, largely because this was one of the first actions taken after the North Korean invasion by Harry Truman. But other than that, not much changed. That is, not much changed until March 5th, 1953. That day, Joseph Stalin died after 4 days of agony caused by blood going into places it wasn't really supposed to go to in his brain. He was 74 years old and had cast a long, brutal shadow over international communism for just short of 30 years. Georgy Malenkov succeeded him as Soviet premier, and all of a sudden, Soviet policy on the Korean War appeared to shift. Stalin had set this shift into motion ever so slightly before, but maintained his insistence on continuing the war at the cost of Chinese and Korean lives until his very end. This shift did not manifest publicly until March 28th, when Kim Il-sung and Peng Do-ai responded affirmatively to a request from Mark Clark to exchange all sick and injured prisoners. That decision came about from a month-long conversation between Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean representatives that resulted in Kim Il-sung quite happily accepting this new Soviet position. While waiting for Clark's response, Zhou Enlai further clarified the communist position on March 30th with a published survey of the negotiations thus far that included a still vague statement on repatriation, but agreed to Clark's offer of a small prisoner swap. Tucked into the rest of the statement was a new piece to the communist position. Zhou stated that a statement of explanation should be given to all prisoners desiring non-repatriation that would surely alleviate any fears they had about returning north of the 38th parallel. Through this crack, a small ray of sunlight appeared. Clark responded on April 5th, proposing a meeting at Panmunjom to discuss the specific mechanism for this small prisoner swap and reopen a wider discussion of repatriation and non-repatriation. Again, Kim Il-sung was in favor of this, not necessarily because he liked the proposal, but because he just wanted an end to the war. When the representatives met at Panmunjom on April 6th, for the first time since October 1952, they set into motion what would become known as Operation Little Switch. Rear Admiral John Daniel led the UN Command delegation and Major General Lee Sang-cho led the Communist delegation. This newest break in the negotiations, like so many others, quickly bogged down in the swampy details. Daniel first proposed that each side generate a list of sick and injured prisoners that were to be swapped. Lee countered by stating that all sick and injured prisoners, as defined by Articles 109 and 110 of the Geneva Convention, should be repatriated. Article 109 just states that sick or injured prisoners should be repatriated, and 110 defines exactly what is meant by sick and injured, which is pretty much just the layman's definitions of those words. Over the next 5 days, the details were relatively quickly ironed out, with the two sides agreeing to swap about 5% of their total POW numbers, with UN Command expecting to repatriate 5,800 and the Communists expecting to repatriate 600. Remember, though, that UN Command held 132,000 POWs to the Communists' 12,000 POWs at this time. On April 11th, they reached an agreement, and 9 days later, Operation Little Switch began. Starting on the 20th, POWs held by each side arrived at Panmunjom, and daily allotments of 100 from the north and 500 from the south, subdivided into groups of 25 for easier processing. In the intervening days, Communist POWs held at Kojido refused fresh clothes, for their current clothes did not properly identify them as prisoners, threw away much of the supplies provided to them because of the propaganda messages those items contained, and deliberately tore pieces off their clothes to give themselves more of an appearance of the oppressed. During the process of moving POWs from the southern camps to Panmunjom, a POW floater of 550 further eligible prisoners that was not accounted for in the original numbers provided earlier in April enabled Clark to convince the Communists to repatriate more than their previously stated figure. This must have been a feint, though, because Lee declared the Communist side of Little Switch over on April 26th to many UN protests. He declared the claims of 375 further Communist-held eligible prisoners spurious, and UN Command had no choice but to just complete their own transfers on May 3rd. In total, the Communists returned 684 men to UN Command's 6,670. For those men, Operation Little Switch was a massive success. For the men left behind in the prison camps, less so. For the negotiators at Panmunjom, it provided a lifeline to get negotiations moving forward again towards an armistice agreement. Adjacent to the Little Switch negotiations, Nam Il sent UN Command a letter maintaining the Communist stance on repatriation, but ended the letter by stating that any prisoners choosing non-repatriation did so out of a fear instilled in them by their captors. Nam, like Zhou earlier, was attempting to again present the matter as one of a choice for the United Nations. Release the prisoners to a neutral nation, and the Communists would convince them of their mistaken ideas. This was a clarification of the idea Zhou first suggested in his post-death of Stalin letter. UN Command responded on the 16th, proposing Switzerland as a potential neutral caretaker of repatriates and suggesting reopening armistice negotiations on the 23rd. The Communists counterproposed the 25th, and that ended up getting delayed until the 26th. Despite the changes in administration both in Washington and Moscow, and despite the changing personalities at the negotiating table, little changed at the negotiating table when the 10 men returned to their seats in late April. The Americans were still pressing for an armistice agreement without forced repatriation, and the Communists were still mostly pressing for an armistice agreement without voluntary repatriation. Each side had replaced 3 of its members during the recess, with Nam Il and Li Sang-cho joined by Cheng Chen-sen, Tsai Chang-wen, and Ting Kuo-yo. Chang and Tsai, but not Ting, were liaison officers for much of the negotiations previously, making them about as well qualified as you could ask for their new task. William Harrison and John Daniel were joined by Choi Duk-shin, Edgar Glynn, and Ralph Osborne. None of those men had experience at Panmunjom, and they relied on Harrison and Daniel's experience to guide them through the remainder of the process. Only Nam and Lee remained from the first 10 men to set foot in the negotiating tent back in July 1951. Upon reconvening on the 26th, Nam launched into his usual rhetoric. This time, he was speaking on an actual proposal to resolve the POW issue, though. This was, again, the same proposal discussed earlier, just with more specifics. All POWs would be repatriated if they so chose, with those choosing non-repatriation placed into the custody of a neutral state where they could be convinced to choose repatriation. Their final fate was then to be decided at the political conference, whenever and wherever that may be. Harrison argued against the length of time that non-repatriated POWs would wait with the neutral nations, 6 months, and said that 60 days was more than enough time. He also argued that keeping POWs in Korea was important, and to send them to the actual neutral nation, as was suggested by the communists, was too costly in time and in resources. He then re-suggested Switzerland as the neutral caretaker, which Nam argued against because of its previous inclusion on the proposed but not enacted Supervisory Commission. Because of UN Command's desire to agree on a neutral nation before moving on to the other areas of disagreement, which again were the length of post-armistice detention, the location of that detention, and the ultimate fate of those detained post-armistice, no progress was made until May, when Nam proposed India, Burma, Indonesia, and Pakistan as neutral caretakers. I'm half surprised that India was included because they did have boots on the ground in Korea as part of the Commonwealth Division. Those weren't combat boots, of course, the Indian contingent was a medical team, but still, they had a presence in UN command and were distinctly tied to a UN allied nation. I'm only half surprised and not fully surprised by their inclusion because the Indian government was really advocating for itself as a neutral party in the wider Cold War. So that they were included on NAM's list shows that this program was successful in some ways up to this point. Harrison proposed Pakistan from NAM's list, and the wheels of peace began moving once again. On May 7th, the Communists rolled back their position on the location and length of post-armistice detention. Instead of accepting Pakistan as the neutral caretaker, they instead counterproposed, essentially against their own proposal, that a neutral nation's repatriation commission be established to manage non-repatriate POWs until their final fate was decided. This commission would include equal numbers of personnel from India, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Switzerland, and Sweden. UN Command responded 6 days later with more concessions on the length of post-armistice detention, shortening it to 30 days, having India act as executive agent of the Commission, instead of allowing each member an equal role in its administration, and the release of all non-patriot POWs if their post-armistice detention concluded with no change in their decision. NAM rejected these requests, and the negotiations again entered a recess until May 25th. When they returned, Harrison requested and NAM accepted that the meeting reconvene as a closed session. This was to limit the propaganda potential of the discussion and allow each side to speak frankly to, hopefully, more quickly reach agreement. In this meeting, Harrison again outlined UN Command's position on the remaining areas of dispute on the POW issue after pointing out the concessions they had already made to the Communists. NAM restated that these proposals were untenable, but agreed to consider them during another recess until June 1st. NAM returned on June 4th with a counterproposal that was similar to that of UN Command, but differed in the final disposition of non-repatriate POWs, which he placed after 120 days, which was split into 90 days for convincing non-repatriates and 30 days for the political conference itself. The Communists' proposal was unclear in that it left a few different paths open for those non-repatriates, something that Harrison disliked. He wanted to decide the mechanism for deciding their fate here and now. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff told Clark to overlook the vagueness of it, and so too did Clark tell Harrison. The field of disagreement narrowed even more, leaving just the number of convincers left to discuss. The Communists wanted 10 agents per 1,000 prisoners. UN Command wanted 5 per 1,000. and they quickly agreed on 7 per thousand. These would be the men who would do the actual work of, as they saw it, deprogramming the prisoners that were misled into choosing non repatriation. Now, the field of disagreement disappeared completely. The liaison staffs prepared the final armistice document and planned on presenting it to their chief delegates on June 8th. As you may remember, though, there was one big thing still standing in the way. Back in November of 1951, both sides had agreed upon a line of demarcation and a surrounding demilitarized zone, but it was written into the agreement that it would expire if a full armistice agreement was not completed in 30 days. Here, now, in June of 1953, we are about 530 days past that mark. Harrison proposed keeping the line upon which they previously agreed, given the relatively small changes all those men died for over the last 18 months. But Nam counter-proposed that the line be updated to match the current battle line, which Harrison quickly consented to, sending their staff officers back to the negotiating table. And as soon as they agreed to these new negotiations, the communists attacked. I hope you didn't forget there was still a war going on. Last episode, I said that the first half of 1953 had some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, and that's not entirely accurate. I was just trying to build some excitement for what, by this point in the conflict, has turned into a bit of a slog. Raids and patrols were, for the most part, the extent of combat during the winter months of early 1953. Once things started to thaw out, the tempo of fighting did pick up. And that's almost entirely because people started to realize the war would probably come to an end soon, and they wanted to place the military demarcation line in the best possible place for themselves. While that could have meant, you stay on that hill over there and I'll stay on this hill over here, it more often was, oh, that's a nice hill you have there. Let me just sneak on by and grab it from you. What was expected to be the final communist offensive in the western half of the front began in late May, with a heavy artillery and mortar barrage opening the attack before a targeted advance against a complex of hills and bunkers, codenamed Nevada. That attack failed. In early June, the communists opened another final attack against the center of the front, attempting to close a salient jutting into their territory. That attack was more successful, making the greatest territorial gains of any offensive since the start of negotiations. Both attacks were costly for the communists, though, with casualties in the thousands. And the end result of these attacks did not much change the status quo on the battlefield or at Panmunjom. Then, a third attack, this time specifically against the ROK Army divisions responsible for the eastern half of the front line, opened in late June. This attack, like the first, failed to make meaningful territorial gains against UN command. With these 3 attacks, though, the communists were successful in making a point to the Americans. The war was not yet over, and they were not yet done fighting. That message wouldn't pay dividends in June, but it will in July. Both in spite of and because of those attacks, or at least the failure of those attacks to really get the war moving again, both sides agreed to a demarcation line following the present battle line after a week of light haggling, entirely over the areas under communist attack. Once those attacks collapsed, the staff officers wrapped everything up with a neat bow on the 16th of June. Again, though, this was not the end of the negotiations process, because there were still 2 more hurdles over which the armistice agreement needed to jump. Every time we think that the agreement should be done, something new popped up to keep them from crossing the finish line. The first was the status of the Neutral Nations Commissions and their inability to reach Korea before mid-July. Specifically, Clark and the Joint Chiefs were concerned that if the armistice was signed before the Commission's representatives were in place in Korea, the Communists would totally ignore any of the provisions of the armistice and conduct a rapid buildup of forces. That the Swedish and Swiss representatives would not reach Korea until July 15th worried Clark until he realized that the Polish and Czechoslovakian representatives also would not arrive in Korea before then, meaning that, even if anyone did arrive earlier, no one would be able to inspect anything anyway. After this realization, Clark was full bore on signing an armistice as soon as possible, and letting the Commission start its work once it was able. The second hurdle was a bit bigger than the first, because the second hurdle was Syngman Rhee, the president of South Korea. The reason for that is because, well, Rhee had an informal veto over the armistice agreement. There was nothing in writing saying that Rhee had to sign off on the final agreement. It was just more of a courtesy extended to him by the Americans, considering they were, only in the war because of South Korea. The reason it's an informal courtesy is because Rhee allowed the South Korean armed forces to be placed within the UN Command Organization early on in the war, taking away his control as commander-in-chief on matters like an armistice agreement. And the reason the Americans extended him this courtesy is because they had invested a good amount of money and material and lives in keeping Rhee's government in place in Korea. If Rhee chose to ignore the armistice and simply command the ROK army to continue fighting, he totally could have, because the only thing keeping him out of the chain of command between South Korean generals and the non-Korean UN command leadership were the actions of those South Korean generals. They could choose to revert back to their commander-in-chief instead of listening to any contravening orders from their American superior officers. Now, I don't know if they would have done that across the board, as it never came to that, but it was a dynamic of which the Americans were acutely aware. By the time 1953 rolls around, Syngman Rhee is generally unhappy with the course of the war, and has been since the beginning of negotiations. The way he sees it, as soon as the Americans sat down at Quezon, they gave up on reunifying his country under his rule, which is not incorrect, but also that was never really the goal of the American presence in Korea anyway. The Americans' actions in the months since had not instilled any confidence in Rhee that the Americans even planned on sticking around after the completion of the armistice. That's why, as we discussed a bit last episode, Rhee wanted the Americans to agree to a few stipulations about the armistice agreement back in April. He wanted all Chinese communist forces out of Korea, he wanted North Korea totally disarmed, he wanted guaranteed UN aid for his country and a total blockade of any assistance to North Korea. He wanted a guaranteed seat at the table of any post-armistice political conference for South Korea, and he wanted assurances of South Korean territorial integrity. Some of these were just not going to happen, and I think Rhee understood that. He was not a stupid man, he just wanted to know that the Americans had his back after the end of the war, and his holding out on the armistice was just a tactic to pressure the Americans into giving him those assurances. Rhee's concern about the loyalty of his American allies was exacerbated by various domestic disturbances throughout the war. One of them, Guerillas, we'll discuss later this episode. Another, that he did not have total control of the National Assembly, has flared up at various points previously that I have not yet discussed, but think are a little important to know about if you want to understand Rhee's position by the end of the war. The biggest split between the Assembly and Rhee came around the national elections of 1952. Rhee wanted to amend the Constitution to allow for direct election of the President and Vice President, a change from the existing selection by the Assembly. That summer, Rhee took direct control of Busan, where the ROK government was then seated, through martial law, and only ended military rule a few weeks after the National Assembly finally gave in to his demands. As part of those 2 months of martial law, he also kind of arrested some of his political enemies. That was not uncommon in South Korea during the war. This made the Americans unhappy, but the orders from Washington were to let Rhee manage domestic affairs so long as they did not infringe upon the conduct of the war. If Rhee wanted to arrest his opponents, so long as he didn't affect UN forces or otherwise hamper the war effort, American commanders just had to accept that. Those arrested were charged as part of an alleged communist conspiracy against Rhee, which of course means that it would be against the state, which was all a load of bunk. The ideological divide between the two Koreas was just a useful tool in the consistent conflict between Rhee and other elected representatives in South Korea. By 1953, Rhee had mostly purged many of his biggest opponents out of the National Assembly and secured a full mandate in the 1952 elections for his platform of not accepting an armistice, if things ever came to that. By the summer of 1953, it looked like things were actually going to come to that. Rhee's personal campaign to pressure the Americans was paired with a public pressure campaign carried out by his supporters. This was mostly done through large rallies and various newspaper pieces to legitimize Rhee's position and express public dissatisfaction with the idea of a negotiated settlement. On April 5th, one such rally had 50,000 Koreans march through Busan with signs reading, "Don't sell out Korea," and "Give us unification or death." On April 21st, the National Assembly passed a resolution echoing Rhee's previous statements on reunification. And Rhee further upped the pressure on that same day by directing the ROK ambassador in Washington to deliver to Eisenhower a message stating Rhee was prepared to pull the ROK army out of UN command if Chinese forces were permitted to remain south of the Yalu River by the armistice agreement. This threat held water because there was no agreement in place to keep the ROKA within the structure of UN command after the signing of the armistice. So, while I said last episode that I don't think Rhee really meant this threat, I do think there was a narrow possibility that he would have gone through with it if the Americans pushed forward regardless of Rhee's opinion. Throughout May, Rhee remained a stick in the mud on several issues that delayed the resumption of armistice discussions more than they already were. On POWs, Rhee continued to refuse to allow non-repatriates to leave the peninsula as the communists wanted, and he eventually got what he wanted when the communists shifted on that point. He also weighed the positives and negatives of all non-Korean forces leaving the peninsula, both Chinese Communist and UN command forces. He would only consent to this with a signed defense treaty between South Korea and the United States, something that the Americans were somewhat hesitant to provide before the signing of the armistice agreement. However, the Americans became more amenable to a defense pact once they started preparing their final offer to the Communists in mid-May. One of the Communists' main issues with the armistice negotiations at this point was that the South Koreans did not appear to be on board with it, mostly because they were not actually on board with it. U.S. military and diplomatic officials quickly understood the necessity that they would need to find some way to placate Rhee if they wanted to end this war anytime soon. In spite of that growing realization, the United States again denied Rhee his defensive pact in late May, which is part of why he refused to accept the UN command's final position when Clark presented it to him. The Eisenhower administration did not, at this time, believe they could successfully pass a U.S.-Korean defensive treaty through Congress, given the low levels of domestic support for the war in general. Over the next 4 days, Rhee mobilized as much of his domestic support as he could to loudly show his disdain for what UN command was about to present at Panmunjom. Even Choi Duk-shin, the ROK Army representative at Panmunjom, railed against, basically, his co-workers. And Harrison quickly cut Choi out of the delegation just a few weeks after he had joined it, with no replacement named. All this pushed Clark to advocate for a defensive pact, the offer of which was approved by Eisenhower on the 29th, but never actually made its way to Reed's desk for reconsideration. Every letter Eisenhower sent to Reed to reiterate his commitment to maintain American support of South Korea was ignored because Reed did not view such verbal commitments as enough. He wanted something more concrete, and he was willing to go to extreme lengths to get it. Then, Reed took potentially his most drastic action of the war. 25,000 non-repatriate, anti-communist POWs held at various camps around southern South Korea violently overpowered their captors and escaped on June 18th. That's the official line from the ROK Army Guards responsible for those camps. What actually happened is that the escapees just kinda ran right by those guards without much fuss. That's because this was all orchestrated from the very top of the ROK government, with Reed later admitting to Clark that he at least knew about it beforehand, although I don't know how much of a role he had in planning the breakout. Earlier in May, he had named Won Young-duk, a Reed loyalist, to the position of Provost Marshal General, then placed the troops guarding the prisoner camps under that office, thus creating a direct line from the camps through to the presidential desk. So even if Reed did not plan the operation, if the initial idea came from someone else, he endorsed it and ensured it went forward. The Americans were not particularly concerned about the breakout itself. These were all prisoners they wanted to release anyway. However, they wanted to release them after the completion of the armistice. The Americans' principal concern was how this all looked to the communists, and it did not look great. Clark, for his part, did quickly inform Nam of the breakout and blamed it all on the South Korean government. Nam, for his part, did not believe that. Which makes sense. If you're already distrustful of your opponent and something happens that you think they wanted to do anyway, it makes sense that you would believe they did it all on purpose. The breakout immediately brought to the fore all the questions Nam and his colleagues had about the UN-ROK relationship that they wanted to ask for a while, but just for whatever reason had not. Again, understandable. Primarily, they wanted to know if South Korea would agree to uphold the armistice as negotiated. If they would not, then there's no point in the communists hanging around in Panmunjom. And it took a couple of days for the Americans to answer that question, because they still weren't sure that the South Koreans would not continue fighting after the signing of the armistice. Between June 20th and June 30th, near daily meetings between some combination of Reed, Clark, and other American military and diplomatic officials, including an Assistant Secretary of State and even the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, failed to resolve the issue of South Korean intransigence on the armistice. The only way forward, Clark saw, was to start acting like UN Command would leave Korea unilaterally after the signing of an armistice agreement, which he set into motion in early July by limiting the amount of supplies and equipment arriving in Korea, by winding down construction projects for UN Command facilities, and by using naval and air assets in ways that portended UN withdrawal. Statements from UN Command leaders solidified what these actions meant, that UN Command was preparing itself to withdraw from Korea if the Republic of Korea chose to carry on with the war. If they so chose, they would do so alone. We'll finish that storyline next episode. It is difficult to discuss the civilian experience during the Korean War, partially because the conflict has not yet ended, and partially because the key cause of the conflict, the division of the Korean Peninsula, has not yet been resolved. This gives any discussion of the civilian experience during the war an ideological bias that can be difficult to parse. Furthermore, and I think more importantly, There's also just not a lot written about the civilian experience during the war, compared to the amount written about the military experience. At least not that I have yet found. And that kind of makes sense. This was a war, after all. But I think it's important to understand that this was a war fought in people's homes, across the roads they traveled every day. And while the civilian experience was not at the center of the conflict, and maybe should not be the center of the conflict, it is certainly an important part of the story. Of course, understanding what it was like to be a civilian during the war has been made even more difficult given the increasingly authoritarian nature of both the Kim and Rhee governments after the end of the war, and the consequent crushing of dissent that often goes along with such despotic shifts. There are some things we know for sure, though, that I think shed some light on what it was like to be a civilian living through this conflict. For one, just to set a foundation for this far too brief discussion, the Korean War was immensely difficult for Korean civilians. That could go without saying, but I don't think I could say enough just how hard these 3 years were for non combatants caught in the crossfire. In both the North and the South, each Korea's leader purged and counterpurged their political opponents to solidify their domestic support. In the last 6 months of the war, both Pak Han-yong and Ho Ki-ai, longtime pillars of Korean communism, were arrested and denounced by the Kim government for treasonous acts against the Korean people and against the anti-imperial war. South of the parallel, Rhee had political opponents arrested and imprisoned without trial on false charges, a sure sign of authoritarianism. Civilians were involved in these purges through what were basically neighborhood watch organizations, or groups of people in villages and urban neighborhoods responsible for ideologically policing their fellow citizens and reporting them to the relevant authorities. As you can probably imagine, a good number of those arrested as part of those programs were just involved in neighborly squabbles. For those not arrested, nearly everything needed for a decent standard of living was either sucked up by the war effort or destroyed by the enemy. Food shortages plagued both countries, with North Korean fields and equipment destroyed by American bombing campaigns, and both Koreas shifting much of their agricultural output towards supporting their fighting men. Rice was almost always replaced in the civilian diet by lesser quality grains, leading to higher rates of malnutrition, disease, and starvation. The mass movements of refugees as the war ebbed and flowed during its first year left a trail of unhoused people, and the many massacres and mass conscription by both sides left many orphans without a family. Just as the weather affected military operations, so too did it affect civilian life, with harsh winters and hot summers a fact of life for those living in thinly constructed houses. Permanent residences were difficult to build and maintain when a war had just run through many places at least 2 or 3 times. Any material that might have allowed someone to build a quality structure went instead to someone with a UN command building contract. Any healthy young men, even unhealthy young men sometimes, were often volunteered for service by those authorities in their area. There are cases of men fleeing with their families as part of the massive flow of refugees before they were conscripted. But these men were quickly separated from the others before some guy in a uniform told them those 4 dreaded words: "Welcome to the army." And it did not matter where those men were from. Koreans were Koreans, and the KPA took many men into their ranks when they occupied South Korea, and the ROKA took many men into their ranks when they occupied North Korea. These near-universal conscription programs remained after the end of the war, creating the highly militarized culture in both Koreas that we see today. There is a divide in the way the war impacted both Koreas, and that comes in the form of the industrial base with which each country finished the war in 1953. Increased military spending in the South built a nascent industrial base that grew after the war, while the heavy bombing campaigns in the north destroyed their industrial base. Now, both Koreas were immensely poor in the decade after the war, but the South Korean companies that managed to snag the many lucrative military contracts of UN Command provided the kernel around which economic growth materialized after the downfall of Syngman Rhee in 1961. North Korea has never recovered from the devastation of the war, or at least they have not yet. For both, the war increased the economic and political ties between their regional neighbors, with the North Koreans increasingly relying on the Chinese and the South Koreans increasingly relying on the Japanese by way of the Americans. To sum things up in short, the war wrought unspeakable havoc on the Korean people, and, in many ways, its legacies defined their economic, political, and civic lives to this very day. There was also a difference in how each side experienced the guerrilla campaigns of the other side. Generally speaking, the South Koreans had much less success with guerrilla campaigns in enemy territory than did the North Koreans. That difference boils down to the different ways each group resisted the Japanese during the colonial period. The Communists resisted through guerrilla warfare, while the non-Communists took more traditionally political paths, or no path of resistance at all. So by the time the Korean War begins in 1950, the Communists, both Korean and Chinese, understand how to run a successful guerrilla campaign in enemy territory. Just to get it out of the way quickly, UN Command did run a small guerrilla campaign in the north, but it was mostly unsuccessful and did not have much of an impact on the war at all. What UN Command did have was a comparatively decent number of Koreans who had served in the Imperial Japanese Army, specifically in units tasked with hunting guerrillas. I hate that I'm using the word hunting in reference to people, but that's kind of the best way to describe both the activities of those units and the mindset each side took into these activities. The guerrillas would hide, harass, and ambush, and the quote-unquote hunters would ruthlessly seek and destroy. Given those colonial experiences and their ideas of the goodness of communism, communist leadership expected a large upswell of support in South Korea upon the arrival of the Korean People's Army. When that did not happen, and when UN Command pushed the KPA back north, small bands of KPA soldiers peeled off of the retreating columns to wage war the way they knew best. These guerrilla bands never really were going to turn the tide of the war, but they were a nuisance to UN Command that persisted up to and beyond the completion of the armistice. In November 1951, Pak Sun-yup, who it's been a while since we've talked about him, took command of the ROKA 8th and Capital Divisions to undertake a major campaign against the guerrillas in South Korea, named Operation Rat Killer. Task Force Pak, as it was known, centered their actions around the guerrilla strongholds of Mount Chiri in south-central Korea. Chiri is a tall peak, surrounded by a ring of smaller peaks that provide good physical security and many valleys, through which the guerrillas could either escape to another hidden base or move quickly to harass the UN's rear areas. Today, it's now a national park. From their Mount Chiri base, the guerrillas of the KPA's Southern Corps, an estimated 3,800 of them, could successfully steal supplies and destroy UN transportation links. So, in late November and early December, the 8th and Capital Divisions withdrew from the front and began their trips southward. The 8th Division pushed southward by land, and the Capital Division transited via Japanese crewed LSTs to the southern coast before pushing northward, creating a vice grip around the guerrillas at Mount Chiri. And by this time of the year, the foliage was replaced by ice and snow, leaving the guerrillas with little natural cover and giving their enemy an easy way to track their movements. On December 2nd, the ROKA began closing its perimeter around the mountain, with military units moving forward and national police units held in reserve to plug any gaps that might form. Nearly 10 million leaflets were dropped on the mountain, and soldiers equipped with loudspeakers blasted appeals to surrender to the guerrillas. Upon reaching the main peak on the 8th, Task Force PAC turned around and swept back down the mountain, pushing remaining guerrillas into the arms of the National Police. After that, they again swept up to the peak of the mountain, which at just over 6,000 feet tall is not particularly easy to do multiple times. Further cleanup operations continued through to early 1952. Officially, Task Force PAC killed 5,800 and captured 5,700 guerrillas in December 1951. Despite those greater than expected casualty figures, though, PAC himself considers Operation Rat Killer only a mild success. He writes in his memoirs of the war that his task force failed to fully eradicate the guerrilla threat, with some slipping out of their net. But he does conclude that he is proud of the operation because of its success in finally spreading ROK governmental control to the area, when before it was almost entirely administered by the guerrillas. In January of 1952, PAC returned to the front. In February, the 8th Division did the same, and finally, in March, the Capital Division also returned north, ending Rat Killer and largely relegating the communist guerrillas to nothing more than a painful nuisance. Through 1952 and 1953, alongside the increasing size of the ROKA, so too did the National Police grow specifically to better manage the guerrilla issue. Both the ROKA and the National Police were as ruthless against the guerrilla threat as their Japanese forebears were, exercising maximum brutality against anyone suspected of guerrilla activities. Communist guerrillas would remain an annoyance long after the end of the war, but never again would they threaten the overall security of the South Korean state. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with our two parties so very close to a final armistice agreement. Next episode, we will discuss the final month of the Korean War. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.